The crisp autumn air swirled around May as she stepped out of the taxi at the private airport terminal. She adjusted her simple canvas tote bag on her shoulder and brushed a loose strand of hair back into her practical ponytail. The driver had raised his eyebrows when she'd given him this address, and now she could see why. The private terminal gleamed with polished marble and sleek glass. Men and women in designer clothes strolled through with an air of entitlement, their luggage wheeled by attendants in crisp uniforms. May glanced down at her worn jeans and comfortable sweater, perfectly adequate for a long flight, she had thought, but clearly out of place here. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. "Just another flight." She approached the check-in desk where a woman with perfectly styled hair looked up with a practiced smile that faltered slightly as she took in May's appearance. "Good morning."
"How may I help you?"
the attendant asked, her tone carrying a hint of doubt. "Good morning. I'm checking in for the Hong Kong flight," May replied, sliding her passport across the counter. The attendant's manicured fingers hesitated before taking the document. She typed something into her computer, then looked up with widened eyes. "Of course, Ms. Lin. You're in first class today." The woman's tone had shifted to one of surprise. "Do you have any luggage to check?" May shook her head. "Just this," she said, patting her tote bag. "I travel light." The attendant handed back her passport along with a boarding pass. "Through those doors and to the right. The first-class lounge is available for your use before boarding." "Thank you," May said with a genuine smile. She knew the lounge would be filled with the same type of people who were already giving her sidelong glances, so she added, "I think I'll just head to the gate." As May walked toward security, she felt the stares. A group of businessmen in suits worth more than her entire wardrobe looked her up and down, then exchanged smirks. A woman with a diamond watch that caught the light with every movement pulled her designer handbag closer as May passed, as if afraid May might snatch it. The security staff checked her boarding pass twice, eyebrows raised in silent question. May was used to it. She'd been underestimated her entire life. By the time she reached the gate, boarding had already begun. The flight attendant at the door, a tall man with a carefully neutral expression, looked at her boarding pass with obvious skepticism. "First class?" he asked, making no effort to hide his doubt. May nodded. "Yes. May I see your passport as well, please?" No one else had been asked for additional identification. May handed over her passport without comment. The flight attendant studied it, looked at her, then back at the document before reluctantly stepping aside. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Lin." The luxury private jet was even more opulent inside than May had expected. The first-class cabin gleamed with soft leather seats, polished wood accents, and subtle lighting. About a dozen passengers were already seated, all dressed for success in clothing that whispered of wealth rather than shouted it. As May made her way down the aisle, conversations paused. Eyes followed her movement. She kept her gaze forward, her expression neutral despite the heat rising to her cheeks. Finding her seat number, she stowed her tote bag and sat down, feeling the butter-soft leather envelop her. A woman across the aisle, with expertly highlighted hair and a silk blouse that probably cost more than May's monthly grocery budget, leaned toward her male companion and whispered something. He glanced at May and chuckled. The flight attendant who had checked her boarding pass appeared at her side. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" he asked, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. May pulled it from her pocket and handed it over. "Is there a problem?" He studied it with a frown. "No, everything appears to be in order. Would you like a pre-flight beverage? Champagne, perhaps?" "Just water, please," May replied. The man nodded and left. May could feel the curious and judgmental gazes of her fellow passengers. A businessman 2 rows ahead turned to look at her directly, making no attempt to hide his assessment. His companion, a woman with an elegant bob and jade earrings, whispered something that made him laugh. "Probably won a contest," May heard someone say, not quite under their breath. "Or cleaning staff getting a free ride," another voice added. May took a deep breath and pulled out her worn but reliable tablet. She had work to do, reports to review before landing. She wouldn't let their assumptions bother her. She'd faced worse. The flight attendant returned with her water, placing it on her armrest with considerably less care than he had shown when serving the other passengers their champagne. "We'll be departing in approximately 20 minutes, he informed her, his tone noticeably cooler than when he addressed the others. A group of 3 executives settled into the seats in front of her. their conversation loud enough for her to hear every word. "Did you see what she's wearing?" one of them said with a laugh. "In first class. Maybe she spent all her money on the ticket," another replied. "Nothing left for decent clothes." "Or maybe she's in the wrong section," the third added. "Wouldn't be the first time." May kept her eyes on her tablet, though the words on the screen blurred as she fought to maintain her composure. She'd worked too hard to let a few snide comments affect her. Besides, she knew something they didn't. More passengers boarded, each one giving her a curious glance. One woman in her 50s, dripping with subtle jewelry that spoke of old money, deliberately placed her designer handbag on the empty seat beside May, though there were other open seats available. "I hope you don't mind," the woman said with a tight smile. "My bag needs its own space." "Of course not," May replied, her voice steady despite the rudeness. As the final boarding call was announced, May pulled out a small packed lunch from her tote, a simple sandwich and an apple. The woman with the jade earrings noticed and nudged her companion. "Look at that," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Brought her own lunch to first class." The man shook his head with a smirk. "Probably never flown first before. Doesn't know the food is included." May unwrapped her sandwich calmly. The truth was, she preferred her own food to airplane meals, no matter how gourmet they claimed to be. But she wasn't about to explain herself to people who had already decided who she was based on her appearance. Distinguished older gentleman in a perfectly tailored suit took the seat across the aisle from her, giving her a curious glance but no obvious judgment. Unlike the others, he simply nodded politely before settling in with a financial newspaper. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing their flight time to Hong Kong. May felt a flutter of excitement despite the uncomfortable atmosphere. She was going home after 3 weeks away, 3 weeks of meetings, negotiations, and decisions that would affect thousands of lives. As the jet began to taxi, the flight attendants demonstrated the safety procedures. May noticed they seemed to skip past her section quickly, focusing their attention on the visibly wealthy passengers. One of them, a woman with a kind face, did catch May's eye and offered a genuine smile, which May returned gratefully. "First time in first class?" The businessman in front of her turned to ask, his tone a mixture of condescension and curiosity. May considered how to answer. She could explain who she was, who her husband was. She could put them all in their place with a few simple words, but that wasn't her way. "No," she said simply. "I travel quite often." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly not believing her. "Business or pleasure?" he pressed. "A bit of both," May replied with a small smile. The woman with the jade earrings leaned forward. "What business are you in?" she asked, her tone suggesting she doubted May could be in any business of importance. Before May could answer, the captain announced they were cleared for takeoff. The powerful engines roared to life and the jet began to accelerate down the runway. May looked out the window, watching as the ground fell away beneath them, the buildings becoming smaller until they were just tiny squares in a complex pattern. Just like people, she thought. From a distance, you couldn't tell which buildings were expensive and which were not. You couldn't see who lived inside them or what their stories were. All the superficial differences disappeared. As the jet climbed through the clouds, May pulled out her notebook and began making notes for her upcoming meetings. The whispers and stares continued around her, but she had learned long ago to create her own bubble of calm amid chaos. Little did her fellow passengers know that in less than 4 hours, their perception of the simple woman in jeans and a sweater would change completely. For now, May was content to let them believe what they wanted. After all, appearances could be deceiving, and assumptions often said more about the people making them than about their subject. The jet leveled off at cruising altitude, and May settled in for the journey, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. The jet had been cruising smoothly for about 20 minutes when the flight attendants began their first-class service. The cabin filled with the rich aroma of gourmet coffee as they wheeled an elegant cart down the aisle. May looked up from her tablet to see the attendants offering hot towels and morning refreshments to the other passengers. "Freshly brewed coffee, sir? Or perhaps our specialty tea selection?" A flight attendant with a perfectly groomed appearance asked the businessman seated in front of May. "Coffee black," he replied without looking up from his financial newspaper. The woman with jade earrings chose a mimosa, accepting the crystal flute with a practiced smile. Across the aisle, the older gentleman who had nodded to May earlier requested green tea with a polite thank you that stood out among the entitled demeanor of the other passengers. When the cart reached May, the attendant's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her tone notably less warm. "Green tea would be lovely, thank you," May replied with a genuine smile. The attendant seemed surprised by her politeness. She poured the tea and handed it to May, who accepted it with both hands, a gesture of respect from her culture that the attendant clearly didn't understand. "Do you have any questions about our service offerings?" the attendant asked hesitantly, as if assuming May might not know how first class worked. "No, thank you. I'm familiar with the service," May answered calmly. From the row ahead, one of the executives turned around, his expensive watch glinting under the cabin lights. "First time in the front of the plane, honey?" he asked with a smirk. "The food is complimentary, you know. You can put away your packed lunch." His two companions chuckled as if he'd said something incredibly witty. "I prefer my own food," May replied simply, "but thank you for your concern." The man looked taken aback for a moment, clearly expecting her to be embarrassed or grateful for his advice. He exchanged glances with his friends, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. Probably better than letting them know you can't afford the champagne." More laughter followed as they turned back around. May took a sip of her tea and returned to her work, though the words on her screen were difficult to focus on with the continuing undercurrent of whispers and glances thrown her way. The woman who had placed her designer bag on the seat next to May was now chatting loudly on the phone despite the flight attendants' earlier request to switch devices to airplane. "Mo, you won't believe who's sitting near me," the woman said into her phone. "Looks like someone wandered in from economy. I don't know how these people get past the gate agents these days." May pretended not to hear, but her cheeks warmed slightly. She'd grown accustomed to judgment over the years, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. She thought of her husband and what he would say if he were here. Probably something about showing them the truth. But May had always preferred to let people reveal their own character rather than correcting their assumptions. An hour into the flight, the captain announced they were experiencing mild turbulence and requested everyone to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. The cabin jostled slightly, causing the woman with jade earrings to gasp and grip her armrests. "Is this normal?" she asked no one in particular, her voice pitched higher with anxiety. "Just a bit of rough air," the older gentleman across from May answered kindly. "Nothing to worry about." The turbulence increased and drinks sloshed in glasses. The group of executives cursed as coffee spilled onto expensive trousers. The woman with the designer bag clutched it protectively to her chest as if it might somehow shield her from danger. May remained calm, continuing to read her report as the plane dipped and swayed. She had flown enough to know that turbulence, while uncomfortable, was rarely dangerous. The businessman who had mocked her earlier noticed her composure. "Not scared of crashing?" he asked, his own knuckles white on the armrest. May looked up with a gentle smile. "The pilots know what they're doing. This is quite normal." As if to challenge her words, the plane dropped suddenly, causing several passengers to cry out. The flight attendant, who had been cooler toward May, stumbled in the aisle, and without thinking, May reached out to steady her. "Thank you," the attendant said. Surprised. "Of course," May replied. The woman studied May's face for a moment, seeming to reassess her earlier judgment. "Can I get you anything else? Another tea, perhaps?" "That would be nice," May said. As the attendant moved away, one of the executives snorted. "Making friends with the staff won't get you an upgrade. We're already in first class." His companion laughed. "Maybe she's hoping for free nuts." The older gentleman across the aisle frowned at their comments. "I find it's always beneficial to be kind to those who serve us," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that momentarily silenced the mockery. The turbulence eventually subsided, and the flight settled back into smooth air. The flight attendant returned with fresh tea for May and a small plate of premium chocolates that she hadn't offered earlier. "You handled that turbulence better than most of our regular travelers," she said in a lower voice. "Are you a frequent flyer?" "Yes, though usually on commercial flights," May answered honestly. The attendant nodded with new respect. "Well, let me know if you need anything else." As she walked away, the woman with the jade earrings leaned toward May. "So what do you do?" she asked, curiosity seemingly getting the better of her disdain. May considered her answer carefully. "I work with various charitable organizations." "Oh," the woman replied, losing interest immediately. Like a volunteer? Something like that, May said, not bothering to correct the assumption. That she wasn't paid for her work. How noble, the woman said with clear insincerity, before turning back to her companion. The businessman, in front, had been listening. Charity work, huh? Must be nice to fly first class on donors' money. His comment was loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear, and May noticed disapproving looks directed her way. The implication that she was misusing charitable funds stung more than the previous mockery. I don't use donation money for personal travel, May said, her voice quiet but firm. The man raised an eyebrow. Then how does someone in your position afford a seat up here? Before May could answer, the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing they were beginning their initial descent toward a stopover to refuel. The interruption gave May a reprieve from the uncomfortable questioning. One of the flight attendants approached with a tablet in hand. Ms. Lin, could I speak with you privately for a moment? May nodded and followed the attendant to a small alcove near the galley. I apologize for the interruption, the attendant said in a hushed tone, but I wanted to inform you that we received a message from Mr. Lin. He asked about your comfort and whether you needed anything during our stopover. May smiled. Please tell him I'm fine, thank you. The attendant looked slightly confused. Of course. He also mentioned that if you preferred, we could arrange for you to wait in the private lounge during the stopover, rather than remaining on board with the other passengers. That's not necessary, May replied. I'm perfectly comfortable here. The attendant hesitated. Are you sure? Some of the passengers have been less than courteous. I've noticed, May said with a small laugh, but I'm used to it. As you wish, the attendant said, clearly puzzled by May's decision. Please let me know if you change your mind. When May returned to her seat, she found the atmosphere had changed subtly. The flight attendant who had taken her to speak privately was now talking in hushed tones with the other crew members, occasionally glancing in May's direction with newfound respect. The woman with the designer bag had finally removed it from the seat next to May, though she didn't acknowledge the change. The three executives were quieter, still throwing curious glances May's way, but with less obvious mockery. Only the older gentleman seemed unchanged, reading his newspaper with the same calm demeanor he had shown throughout the flight. As May settled back into her seat, he looked up and smiled. People are often quick to judge what they don't understand, he said quietly. May returned his smile. Yes, but sometimes it's more interesting not to correct them. He chuckled. A wise approach, though I suspect there's more to your story than meets the eye. Isn't that true for everyone? May replied. Their conversation was interrupted by the captain announcing they were beginning their final approach for the stopover. The passengers secured their belongings and prepared for landing. The woman with jade earrings still looked nervous, clutching her armrests during the descent. May closed her eyes briefly, thinking about what might happen during the stopover. Her husband had a tendency to be protective, and she wondered how he might have responded to the message from the flight attendant. She hoped he wouldn't make a scene. The last thing she wanted was embarrassment on either side. As the wheels of the jet touched down with a gentle bump, May opened her eyes to see the flight attendants already moving with a new sense of purpose. Something had changed, and she had a feeling the peaceful anonymity she had been enjoying despite the mockery was about to come to an end. What none of the passengers knew was that the stopover would bring revelations that would change how they all saw the simple woman in jeans and a sweater. But for now, May was content to gather her things and prepare for what would come next. Her quiet dignity intact despite the hours of subtle and not-so-subtle ridicule. The private airport where they had stopped for refueling was small but luxurious, with gleaming floors and tasteful artwork on the walls. As the passengers disembarked for the brief stopover, May noticed a subtle change in how the flight attendants addressed her, their tone more respectful, their smiles more genuine. She wondered if her husband had said something in his message that had changed their perception. Ms. Lin, if you'd like to stretch your legs, we have a private waiting area available, the head flight attendant told her quietly as passengers filed past them. Thank you, but I'll join the others, May replied with a smile. I enjoy people watching. The attendant nodded, though she looked slightly concerned. As you wish. The stopover should be approximately 45 minutes. The first-class lounge was a study in understated luxury, plush sofas, a well-stocked bar, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway. The passengers who had been mocking May earlier immediately gravitated toward the bar, while others found comfortable seats and pulled out phones or tablets. May chose a seat slightly apart from the others, near the windows where she could watch the maintenance crew examining their jet. She pulled out her worn notebook and began making notes, occasionally glancing up to observe her fellow travelers. The three executives who had been seated in front of her were now at the bar, accepting glasses of expensive whiskey from the bartender. One of them kept looking her way, his expression a mixture of curiosity and lingering disdain. The woman with jade earrings was on her phone again, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The flight's been delayed. Some technical issue with the jet. Can you believe it? All this money and they can't even keep the plane running properly." May hid a small smile. People's expectations often revealed more about them than they realized. She had grown up with very little in a small apartment above her parents' noodle shop. Even now, with all the resources at her disposal, she found the sense of entitlement displayed by many wealthy people to be both fascinating and slightly sad. The older gentleman who had been seated across from her entered the lounge and, after getting a cup of tea from the bar, approached her. "Mind if I join you?" he asked politely. "Not at all," May replied, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. He settled in with a sigh of contentment. "I find these forced stops are often a blessing in disguise, a chance to stretch the legs and reset the mind." May nodded in agreement. "I think so too, though not everyone shares that view." She nodded discreetly toward the woman still complaining loudly on her phone. The man chuckled. "Patience is becoming a rare virtue these days." He extended his hand. "I'm Thomas, by the way." "May," she replied, shaking his hand. "So, May," he said, taking a sip of his tea, "you mentioned you work with charitable organizations. Anything specific?" "Education and microloans primarily," she answered, "helping women in rural communities start small businesses." Thomas's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Fascinating work. I've done some philanthropy in that area myself. The return on investment, in human terms, is remarkable." For the first time since boarding, May found herself in a conversation with someone who seemed to see beyond appearances. They discussed various approaches to sustainable development and the challenges of working across cultural boundaries. May was careful not to reveal too much about the scale of her involvement, but she enjoyed the chance to talk about the work that meant so much to her. Their conversation was interrupted when the lounge door opened and a distinguished-looking man in a pilot's uniform entered. He scanned the room quickly, then made a beeline for the head flight attendant who was refreshing her coffee at the bar. They spoke in hushed tones, with the pilot occasionally glancing in May's direction. The attendant nodded and straightened her uniform before approaching May and Thomas. "Excuse me, Ms. Lin," she said, her voice carrying a new note of deference. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Thomas raised an eyebrow but said nothing as May excused herself and followed the attendant to a quiet corner. "I apologize for the interruption," the attendant said, "but I've just been informed that there's a more significant issue with the aircraft than initially thought. The captain wanted you to know personally that we're preparing another jet for departure within the hour." May frowned slightly. "Is everyone being informed?" The attendant looked uncomfortable. "We're about to make a general announcement, but the captain felt you should be notified first given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" May asked, genuinely confused. The woman's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, I'm sorry, I assumed you were aware. Your husband has arranged for his personal jet to be prepared for our continued journey. The captain has been in communication with Mr. Lin's staff." May felt a mixture of amusement and exasperation. This was exactly what she had hoped to avoid, special treatment that would draw attention. She had specifically chosen to fly on the company's commercial jet, rather than their personal one, to maintain her privacy. "I see," she said after a moment. "Thank you for letting me know." "Of course," the attendant replied, now almost reverential in her manner. "Is there anything you need while we wait?" "No, thank you. I'm perfectly comfortable." As the attendant walked away, May noticed several of the passengers watching the interaction with curious eyes. She returned to her seat beside Thomas, who was trying and failing to hide his interest in what had just transpired. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Just some information about our delay," May replied casually. "Nothing serious." Thomas nodded, though his eyes held a knowing look. "I see." Before either could say more, the head flight attendant cleared her throat to address the lounge. Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that our aircraft requires additional maintenance that cannot be completed within our scheduled stopover. However, I'm pleased to announce that alternate arrangements have been made. Another jet is being prepared for us now, and will be ready for boarding in approximately 30 minutes. We apologize for any inconvenience and thank you for your patience. A murmur of annoyance spread through the lounge. The woman with jade earrings made a show of sighing dramatically. Unbelievable, she said to no one in particular. What are we supposed to do for half an hour? One of the executives who had mocked May earlier raised his empty whiskey glass. Keep drinking their expensive booze, I suppose, he said, causing his companions to laugh. As the bartender refilled their glasses, May noticed the pilot who had entered earlier speaking urgently into his phone. After a moment, he approached the head flight attendant again and whispered something in her ear. The woman's eyes widened and she glanced at May with a new expression of something approaching awe. May had a sinking feeling she knew what was happening. Her husband, never one for subtlety, was probably making his presence known. She had hoped to complete this journey without revealing her connection to him, partly because she enjoyed her anonymity, but mostly because she believed people showed their truest selves when they didn't know who she was. The head flight attendant approached her again, this time with the pilot in tow. Ms. Lin, the pilot said with a respectful nod. I'm Captain Reynolds. I've just been speaking with Mr. Lin's chief of staff. The replacement aircraft is Mr. Lin's personal jet, which was already at this airport for maintenance. They're expediting the preparations now. May nodded, aware that conversations around them had hushed as people strained to hear what was being said. Thank you, Captain. That's very kind of my husband, but please don't rush on my account. Safety first, of course, ma'am, the captain replied. Mr. Lin also asked if you would prefer to board separately from the other passengers, but I informed his staff that you had declined the private lounge earlier, so I assumed. Your assumption was correct, May said with a smile. I'm happy to board with everyone else. The captain looked relieved. Very good. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. As he and the flight attendant walked away, the lounge erupted into whispered conversations. May could feel the curious stares from all directions. The three executives at the bar were openly gaping now, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. Thomas chuckled beside her. Well, that was interesting, May sighed. My husband has a flair for the dramatic, I'm afraid. Lin, Thomas said thoughtfully. Not Daniel Lin of Asia Tech? May nodded reluctantly. Yes, that's my husband. Thomas let out a low whistle. One of the wealthiest tech entrepreneurs in Asia, and his wife is sitting here being snubbed by people who probably use his products every day. There's a certain poetry to it. I prefer to travel without the baggage of my husband's name, May explained. People treat you differently when they know. I can imagine, Thomas said, gesturing subtly toward the three executives, who were now huddled in intense conversation, occasionally throwing glances her way. Though I suspect the treatment you were receiving earlier wasn't much better. May shrugged. At least it was honest. I'd rather be judged for who they think I am than fawned over for who my husband is. The woman with jade earrings had stopped complaining and was now frantically fixing her makeup, as if preparing for an important meeting. The woman who had placed her designer bag on the seat next to May was whispering urgently to a companion. Her expression mortified. It seems the tide is turning, Thomas observed with amusement. So it seems, May agreed, watching as the dynamics of the entire lounge shifted around her. It was always the same when people discovered who her husband was. The sudden respect, the awkward attempts to befriend her, the thinly veiled efforts to gain favor. As if on cue, one of the executives from the bar approached their table, his manner completely transformed from his earlier mockery. Excuse me, he said with a forced smile. I couldn't help overhearing. Are you Mrs. Lin? Daniel Lin's wife. May looked up at him, remembering his earlier comments about charity workers flying first class on donors' money. Yes, I am, she replied simply. The man's smile widened. I'm Richard Wilson, VP of Global Development at Nextech. We've been hoping to partner with your husband's foundation for years. What a remarkable coincidence meeting you here. There was no coincidence about it, of course. May had been reviewing Nextech's proposal during the flight. Their application for funding had shown promise but raised questions about sustainability. How interesting, May said politely. What a small world. As Richard launched into an improvised pitch about his company's commitment to social responsibility, May caught Thomas's eye. The older man was struggling not to laugh at the sudden transformation in the executive's behavior. The head flight attendant saved her by announcing it was time to board the new aircraft. As the passengers gathered their belongings, May noticed how the social hierarchy of the group had completely shifted. Those who had been dismissive of her were now trying to position themselves nearby, while those who had been openly rude seemed to be avoiding her gaze. "After you, Mrs. Lynn," Richard said, gesturing for her to go ahead. "Please, call me May," she replied, gathering her simple tote bag. "And I believe the boarding order is by seat number, not social status." Richard blinked in surprise at her gentle rebuke, while Thomas coughed to hide his amusement. As they filed toward the door, May wondered what her fellow passengers would think when they saw the replacement jet. Her husband's personal aircraft was considerably more luxurious than the commercial jet they had been on, and it bore the Asiatech logo prominently on its tail. The revelation was only beginning, and May prepared herself for the dramatic shift in attitude she knew was coming. The passengers walked across the tarmac toward their replacement aircraft, and a collective gasp rose from the group as they caught sight of it. Unlike the commercial jet they had arrived on, this was clearly a private luxury aircraft. Its sleek design gleamed under the afternoon sun, and the distinctive Asiatech logo, a stylized blue and silver A, was emblazoned prominently on the tail. May felt a twinge of embarrassment. Her husband had always had a flair for the dramatic, and this aircraft was his pride and joy, custom designed with no expense spared. She had specifically chosen to fly on the company's commercial jet rather than this one to avoid drawing attention, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. That's Daniel Lynn's personal jet," the woman with jade earrings whispered loudly to her companion. "The Asiatech Falcon. I saw it featured in Aviation Monthly." The three executives who had mocked May earlier were now staring with undisguised awe. Richard Wilson, who had so eagerly introduced himself to May in the lounge, pulled out his phone and discreetly took a photo of the aircraft. "Is that real gold trim on the windows?" someone asked. "No, just specialized coating to reduce glare and heat," May answered without thinking, though my husband did consider gold at one point. Her casual comment caused several heads to turn in her direction. The realization was spreading through the group like wildfire. This simple woman in jeans and a sweater wasn't just connected to Daniel Lynn, she was his wife. Captain Reynolds stood at the foot of the boarding stairs greeting each passenger. When May approached, he gave a respectful nod. "Mrs. Lynn, on behalf of the entire crew, I want to apologize for the inconvenience." "No apology necessary, Captain," May replied warmly. "These things happen." As she climbed the stairs, she could hear the whispers behind her growing in volume. The woman with the designer bag who had refused to let May sit next to her was now frantically trying to catch up. "Mrs. Lynn," she called, "I believe we're seated together. Let me just say what an honor it is to—" "Actually," the head flight attendant interrupted smoothly, "we have a different seating arrangement on this aircraft. If you'll all please follow me, I'll show you to your assigned places." The interior of Daniel's jet was a far cry from even the first-class cabin they had been in before. Instead of rows of seats, the main cabin was arranged like a luxurious living room, with butter-soft leather couches, individual recliners, and even a small conference area. A bar staffed by a private bartender occupied one corner, and the lighting was soft and adjustable. The passengers entered with expressions of wonder, many of them stopping in their tracks to take in the opulence. May noticed with amusement that several were trying to discreetly photograph the interior with their phones. "Ladies and gentlemen," the head flight attendant announced, "welcome aboard. As you can see, this aircraft has a different configuration than our usual jet. We've assigned seating based on your original tickets, but there is more flexibility here. Mrs. Lynn has kindly agreed to allow us to use her husband's personal aircraft for the remainder of our journey." All eyes turned to May, who smiled uncomfortably at the sudden attention. "Please make yourselves comfortable," she said. "It's just an airplane after all." But it wasn't just an airplane, and everyone knew it. This was the private transport of one of the wealthiest tech moguls in Asia, a man whose net worth was estimated in the billions, whose products were used by millions. and whose philanthropic foundation funded projects around the world. The flight attendants began showing passengers to their seats. May noticed that Thomas had been assigned to a comfortable recliner near hers. He sat down with a bemused expression. "Quite the upgrade," he commented quietly as May took her seat. "My husband does enjoy his comforts," she replied with a small smile, "though I've always found it a bit excessive." "Hence the jeans and sweater?" Thomas asked perceptively. May nodded. "I grew up with very little. Sometimes all this," she gestured around the cabin, "feels like someone else's life." Their conversation was interrupted as Richard Wilson approached, now accompanied by his two colleagues. The men who had been openly mocking her hours earlier now stood before her with uncomfortable smiles. "Mrs. Lynn," Richard began, "I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding earlier. Had we known who you were, you would have treated me differently," May finished for him. "Yes, that's generally how it works." Richard blinked, caught off guard by her directness. "I just meant that—" "I know what you meant," May said, not unkindly. "And that's precisely why I don't usually announce my husband's name when I travel." One of Richard's colleagues stepped forward. "Mrs. Lynn, we were reviewing your husband's foundation work during our stopover. The educational initiatives in rural communities are truly groundbreaking. Our company has been developing technology that might complement those efforts. How fortunate that you discovered this mutual interest today," May replied, her tone making it clear she understood the sudden change in their attitude. The men exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to her polite but unmistakable rebuke. "Perhaps you could leave your business cards with my assistant," May suggested, nodding toward one of the flight attendants. "I'll make sure the Foundation's director receives them." They nodded eagerly and moved away, clearly relieved to escape the awkward situation. As soon as they were out of earshot, Thomas chuckled. "You handled that gracefully," he said. "Most people in your position would have enjoyed watching them squirm a bit more." "What would be the point?" May asked. "Embarrassment rarely leads to genuine change." The woman with jade earrings was now hovering nearby, clearly working up the courage to approach. When May caught her eye, she came over with a practiced smile. "Mrs. Lin, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Patricia Huang, head of Asian markets for Bolton Investments. Your husband's growth strategy for Asia Tech has been a case study at our firm. Simply brilliant." "I'll tell him you said so," May replied. "He always appreciates feedback from financial experts." Patricia brightened. "Oh, well, I would be happy to offer more specific insights. Perhaps we could exchange contact information?" "Of course," May said, accepting the business card Patricia quickly produced. "Though I should mention I have very little involvement in my husband's business decisions. My focus is our foundation work." "The foundation." "Yes, of course," Patricia pivoted smoothly. "Such important work. We at Bolton have a substantial fund for socially responsible investments that might align with your mission." May nodded politely. "How interesting. As I mentioned to those gentlemen, you can leave your information with my assistant." After Patricia walked away, Thomas leaned closer. "Does this happen everywhere you go?" "Only when people find out who my husband is," May replied. "It's why I prefer to travel under the radar when possible." "And the jeans and sweater? Is that part of the disguise?" May laughed genuinely for the first time since boarding. "No, that's just me. I've never quite adjusted to designer clothes and jewelry. My mother would say I'm wasting opportunities, but comfort matters more to me than appearance." As they spoke, the head flight attendant approached with a satellite phone. "Excuse me, Mrs. Lin, your husband is on the line." May took the phone with a small sigh. "Hello, dear." "Yes, I'm fine." "No, that wasn't necessary. We would have been fine on the commercial jet." She looked around at the luxurious cabin and the now deferential passengers. "Yes, it's causing quite a stir. I know you were concerned." She listened for a moment, then laughed softly. "Well, that's one way to look at it. I'll see you soon." "Love you too." She handed the phone back to the attendant with a thank you. "Everything all right?" Thomas asked. "My husband wanted to make sure I was comfortable," May explained, "and to remind me that sometimes it's good for people to be reminded not to judge by appearances." "A lesson well delivered," Thomas agreed, looking around at the transformed social dynamics of the cabin. The woman who had placed her designer bag on the seat next to May on the previous flight was now sitting alone, her expression mortified every time she accidentally caught May's eye. The flight attendants, who had initially been cool toward May, were now providing attentive service to everyone while treating her with special deference. Captain Reynolds approached, offering May a tablet. "Mrs. Lin, we've uploaded the flight plan for your approval. We'll be taking a slightly different route than originally scheduled, which should get us to Hong Kong about 30 minutes earlier." "I'm sure whatever you recommend is fine, Captain," May replied. "I trust your judgment." As the captain returned to the cockpit, May noticed the subtle but significant way everyone on the plane was now watching her, studying her clothes, her mannerisms, her interactions. The simple woman they had dismissed was now the center of their universe. The engines began to hum as they prepared for takeoff. May gazed out the window, thinking about how quickly perceptions could change. In just a few hours, she had gone from being an object of ridicule to being the most important person on the plane, and she hadn't changed a bit. As the jet accelerated down the runway, May felt a mixture of emotions: amusement at the situation, mild embarrassment at being the center of attention, but also a quiet satisfaction. Perhaps her husband was right. Sometimes people needed reminders about looking beyond appearances. The plane lifted smoothly into the air, carrying them toward Hong Kong and whatever awaited them there. But the real journey had already taken place, not across oceans, but across the social landscape of human prejudice and its aftermath. The remainder of the flight to Hong Kong passed in a surreal bubble of luxury and deference. May watched with quiet amusement as the same passengers who had sneered at her jeans and sweater now hung on her every word. Flight attendants who had previously checked her boarding pass twice now anticipated her needs before she could express them. It was the same pattern she had seen countless times before. The dramatic shift in how people behaved once they knew about her husband's wealth and power. Thomas remained beside her, the only person whose demeanor hadn't changed with the revelation. As a flight attendant served them both tea in hand-painted porcelain cups, he leaned over with a conspiratorial smile. "I must say, this has been the most entertaining flight I've ever experienced," he said quietly. "Better than any in-flight movie." May laughed softly. "I'm glad someone is enjoying it. I find it all rather exhausting." "I can imagine," Thomas replied. "Though I'm curious, why do you put yourself through this? Surely you could fly privately all the time and avoid the judgment." May considered his question carefully. "I could," she admitted. "But then I'd be surrounded only by people who already know who I am and what I represent. I'd never see the world as it truly is," Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "And the world isn't always kind to a woman traveling alone in simple clothes." "No," May agreed. "But that's precisely why I need to experience it. The foundation I oversee helps women in situations far more difficult than being mocked for my clothing choices. How can I understand their challenges if I'm always cushioned by privilege?" Their conversation was interrupted as Richard Wilson approached again, this time with a tablet in hand. "Mrs. Lin, I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said with exaggerated politeness, "but I thought you might be interested in seeing the proposal we've been developing for rural technology education. It aligns perfectly with your foundation's mission." May suppressed a sigh. The same man who had joked about charity workers misusing donor funds now wanted to present himself as deeply committed to educational causes. "That's thoughtful of you, Mr. Wilson," she replied. "Though I wonder, if we had met under different circumstances, would you have been as eager to share your company's philanthropic vision?" Richard's confident smile faltered. Well, of course. It's just that earlier today you seemed to have some strong opinions about charity workers flying in first class," May continued, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You implied that people in my position might be misusing funds meant for those in need." The executive's face flushed red. "Mrs. Lin, I deeply regret those comments. They were completely inappropriate and don't reflect my true values or those of my company." "I see," May said. "And what are your true values, Mr. Wilson?" The question hung in the air between them. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I believe in creating opportunities for those less fortunate," he said finally, though the words sounded rehearsed and hollow. May nodded politely. "A worthy goal. Perhaps we could start by examining how we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer us." Richard looked genuinely uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from one foot to another. "I deserved that," he admitted, "and I apologize again for my behavior." "Apology accepted," May said. "Now, about your proposal, you can send it to our foundation's general submission address. All proposals are reviewed based on their merit, not on personal connections. As Richard walked away, looking both chastened and disappointed, Thomas chuckled. That was masterfully done. Firm but not unkind. May shrugged. I've had practice. People rarely change their fundamental nature just because they discover you're wealthy. They just hide it better. Across the cabin, Patricia Huang was clearly trying to work up the courage to approach again. The woman with the designer bag was now frantically typing on her phone, occasionally glancing up at May. From snippets of conversation May overheard, it seemed many of them were researching her online, discovering her role as the executive director of the Lin Foundation, and her background before marrying Daniel. One of the flight attendants approached with a fresh pot of tea. Mrs. Lin will be beginning our descent into Hong Kong in about 20 minutes. Your husband's car will be waiting on the tarmac. Thank you, May replied. Will everyone else have ground transportation arranged as well? The attendant looked surprised by the question. I believe the regular shuttle service to the terminal will be available, but please arrange private cars for all passengers, May said. Charge it to our account. Of course, Mrs. Lin, the attendant replied, hurrying away to make the arrangements. Thomas raised an eyebrow. That's very generous. It's the least I can do after disrupting everyone's travel plans, May said. I doubt many would see it that way, Thomas observed. Considering the upgrade they've received, May smiled. Perhaps, but true generosity shouldn't depend on how others have treated you. As the plane began its descent toward Hong Kong, the head flight attendant made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach to Hong Kong International Airport. On behalf of Mrs. Lin and AsiaTech, I'm pleased to inform you that private ground transportation has been arranged for all passengers upon arrival. A murmur of surprise and appreciation spread through the cabin. May noticed several passengers looking her way with newfound respect. Not the fawning attention they had shown after discovering her identity, but something more genuine. Patricia Huang finally gathered her courage and approached. Mrs. Lin, I wanted to say something, and it's not about business connections or investments. May looked up, intrigued by the change in the woman's tone. Yes? I behaved poorly earlier, Patricia said, her usual polished confidence replaced with genuine discomfort. The truth is, I saw your clothes and made assumptions. I do that a lot in my line of work, sizing people up, categorizing them. It usually serves me well professionally, but today it made me act in a way I'm not proud of. It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had said to May all day. Thank you for saying that, she replied. We all make judgments based on appearances. The question is whether we're willing to look deeper. Patricia nodded. I'll remember that. She hesitated, then added, Your foundation's work with girls' education in rural communities. It's remarkable. My mother grew up in a village where girls rarely finished school. If programs like yours had existed then, her life might have been very different. For the first time, May saw beyond Patricia's polished exterior to the person beneath. Perhaps you'd like to visit one of our projects sometime, she suggested. Not as an investor, but as someone with a personal connection to the mission. Patricia's expression brightened with genuine interest. I'd like that very much. As Patricia returned to her seat, the captain announced their final approach. May gazed out the window at the glittering skyline of Hong Kong, thinking about the strange journey of the past several hours. What had begun as yet another uncomfortable experience of being judged and dismissed had turned into something more meaningful. A reminder of why she chose to move between different worlds rather than remaining safely in her bubble of privilege. The plane touched down, smoothly on the runway, taxiing toward a private section of the airport. As they came to a stop, May could see a small fleet of luxury cars waiting on the tarmac. Standing beside the lead car was a tall man in a simple but clearly expensive suit. Daniel, is that him? Thomas asked, following her gaze. The famous Daniel Lin? May nodded. That's my husband. He doesn't look like a typical billionaire, Thomas observed. No entourage. He has his own dislike of pretension, May explained, though he expresses it differently than I do. As the passengers prepared to disembark, many of them came over to thank May personally for the upgrade and the arranged transportation. Their gratitude seemed genuine, without the calculating networking attempts from earlier. Perhaps the lesson had sunk in, at least temporarily. The woman who had placed her designer bag on the seat next to May on the original flight approached last, her expression deeply embarrassed. Mrs. Lynn, I don't expect you to remember me, but I remember, May said gently. The woman nodded miserably. I was incredibly rude to you. There's no excuse. We all have bad days, May offered. Yes, but... The woman hesitated. The truth is, I saw someone who looked like they didn't belong in first class, and I wanted to make sure everyone knew I did belong. It was about my insecurity, not about you at all. May was surprised by the insight. That's a remarkably honest observation. This experience has been educational, the woman admitted. Thank you for your kindness despite how I behaved. As the passengers filed off the plane, May remained seated, watching them go. Thomas stood and offered his hand. It's been a pleasure, Mrs. Lynn, he said. A rare privilege to see such a masterclass in grace under pressure. Will you be in Hong Kong long? May asked, shaking his hand. A few days for business, then back to London. Perhaps you'd join my husband and me for dinner tomorrow. I have a feeling you two would get along well. Thomas smiled. I'd be delighted. May was the last to exit the aircraft. As she descended the stairs, Daniel walked forward to meet her, his expression a mixture of amusement and affection. Quite the adventure, my dear? He asked, kissing her cheek. You could say that, May replied. Though next time perhaps we could avoid the dramatic rescue with your personal jet, Daniel laughed. And miss the opportunity to show a plane full of judgmental people the error of their ways? Where's the fun in that? He took her simple canvas tote bag and offered his arm as they walked toward their waiting car. Behind them, the passengers who had once mocked and dismissed May were being escorted to their own luxury vehicles, their perceptions permanently altered by the day's events. You know, Daniel said as he opened the car door for her, you could make your life much easier by dressing the part of a billionaire's wife. May smiled as she settled into the seat. But then how would I know who sees me for who I am rather than what I have? As their car pulled away from the airport, May thought about the lessons of the day, not just for her fellow passengers but for herself as well. In a world obsessed with appearances and status, there was value in sometimes setting these things aside, in making oneself vulnerable to judgment in order to see the truth of how people behave. A simple woman in jeans and a sweater had boarded a plane and been laughed at by strangers. But it was those strangers who had ultimately learned the most important lesson of all, that true worth had nothing to do with designer clothes, expensive watches, or even the name of the jet emblazoned on one's luggage.